Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, what is it like to live in a disaster area for years when people all around you are leaving? A conversation with award-winning author and columnist Tim Egan about America's Dust Bowl survivors and why their story still affects us in the West today. Next. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you listening on public radio and the World Wide Web. In John Steinbeck's famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, Grandpa Jode tells his family he won't leave his Oklahoma farm, even though it's just a pile of dust. "This here is my country," says Grandpa. "I belong here. This country ain't no good, but it's my country." Grandpa's family had to drug him with cough syrup to get him onto the truck. And Steinbeck's account of the Jodes' migration to California, which won both a Pulitzer and a Nobel Prize for literature, would become the epic story of the so-called Okies. But 2/3 of the people who owned land in the Dust Bowl of the 30s actually did what Grandpa Jode tried to do. They stayed, and many suffered enormously. Their stories rise from the ashes in Tim Egan's book, The Worst Hard Time, which won a National Book Award in 2006. And Mr. Egan joins me today to talk about that work and his other writings. Welcome.
Hi, great to be with you.
Now, a bit more about my guest. Mr. Egan worked for 18 years as a reporter for the New York Times and is now a columnist for that paper, specializing in coverage of the Western United States. He's written 5 books, including The Good Rain, Across Time and Terrain in the Pacific Northwest, and Lasso the Wind, Away to the New West. In 2001, Mr. Egan was part of a team of New York Times reporters that won a Pulitzer Prize for a series called How Race is Lived in America. And one note to our viewers, since this program is taped, there will be no call-ins. Thanks again for being here. It's great to have you here.
Pleasure for me.
And I wanted to start with the fabulous book, The Worst Hard Time, as we mentioned about the Dust Bowl. Aside from winning the National Book Award, which has to be just, a highlight of your life, you've said that writing this book literally changed your life.
Yeah, it did.
Why?
Well, I realized how easy we have it in modern life was one of the things. I also realized how little I knew about something that is so epic and integral to our history. I have a son who's in high school now, and he has an AP history book he brought home the other day, about 800 pages thick. And there was one paragraph on the Dust Bowl. And this thing was seared into the memory of an entire generation of people. But what happened, Marcia, was, and this often happens in history, a story was told, the story you alluded to, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. It's a beautiful, wonderful book. But it wasn't the truer, larger story. It was the story of the people who left. It wasn't the story of the people who stayed behind. And no one bothered to ask the what-if question. And I sort of stumbled upon the what-if question. And these little towns down in Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas Panhandle, they're just full of these, dying folks in their 80s and 90s, and they have this wonderful, amazing story to tell. And it changed my life in the sense that I was sort of just a bridge from them to somebody, to all of us.
We saw some photos come up when you were just talking, some classic photos of this time. I was amazed reading your book, and again, I just learned about it in school, how long this actually went on. I mean, it
Absolutely.
was, I thought, maybe 1 or 2 years. It went on for years and years and years.
Yeah, it's been judged by historians since as the worst environmental disaster in the United States history. It was largely man-caused, and that's why they judged it that. It was also a calamity that happened at the worst economic disaster. We've never had a greater depression. Remember, 1 in 4 people were out of work. We had no Social Security. That came in 1935. We had no FDIC backing the banks, so banks would fail right and left, and people's money would just go out the door. We had no farm price support, which we have now to keep farmers alive during bad years. So when the grain price went down, you were done. We had none of this government safety net. We had 1 in 4 people out of work. You had people, and this stunned me the first time I heard it, that I kept hearing it, literally eating brined tumbleweed at one point, because tumbleweed was something, interestingly, that was brought over by these Germans from Russia. Incidentally, it was sewn into the vests they had this turkey red wheat, and with it was tumbleweed. And that was the only thing that would grow for part of the Dust Bowl.
Well, those details, like tumbleweed, eating tumbleweed, are very important to you as a writer, I know. And so are the smaller stories within the larger stories. And what's fabulous about your book is, you take us through a couple of individual stories. And I want to show a clip from a very famous film from that time called The Plow That Broke the Plains. And let's take a look at that clip because it relates directly to one of the characters in your book.
High winds and sun, high winds and sun. A country without rivers and with little rain. Settler, plow at your peril.
Prescient words. I showed that because the man in that film, and I hope I pronounce his name right, Bam?
Bam, that's right.
White.
And his son's name was Melt.
And his son is, you don't get names
you
like
don't get
that
names
anymore.
like that. No, you don't.
But Bam's story, and his son, who's still alive when you talk to him, Melt, is part of your book. And he was in that film. The first time he'd ever seen a movie was when the family went to see him in that.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, the way this turned out. The White family I was really fascinated by because they had a little bit, not a little bit, they had a fair amount of Indian blood in them. And one of the stories of the Dust Bowl is that the natives who lived there actually did prosper. When this part of the United States was grassland, you had bison, and that's all these people really needed to prosper. At the start of the 20th century, the Indians were all gone, the bison was gone, and it was sort of a tabula rasa. The United States government said, what do we do with this area? And they encouraged people to come down and turn it over and grow wheat and make farmlands out of it. The White family came and they wanted to be ranchers. They wanted to graze, not to farm. They wanted to, raise cattle and horses, and they'd had a terrible time of it. I mean, they lived in this little two-room shack where the wind would blow the dust in, and their mother would wake up in the morning and just cry her eyes out. She was so depressed. And the static electricity would come through with these storms sometimes, and it would just shock them. Well, when this film was made, he ended up as that figure we just saw there. And he not only went to see the movie, the first movie he'd ever seen 35 times, but President Franklin Roosevelt himself saw the film in the White House. It was a connection from these little people to, quote, little people, to the highest level of the highest office in the land.
When we see some of this footage here, it's even really hard to imagine. And this film was done a little bit after the main part of the Dust Bowl was gone, but people would try and seal up their windows like this, and it would just still come in. It was everywhere, and people got dust pneumonia, excuse me, from breathing this in. As you mentioned, people couldn't even touch each other because of the static electricity between people. I mean, it's just amazing to me that why people actually stayed in the first place. And as your book points out, some of them were immigrants who had suffered even more hardship in their own country, and like Grandpa Joad, hey, this is my plot of land, I'm not giving it up.
Right. It was a piece of dirt, and the piece of dirt was blowing to the sky, but it was their piece of dirt, and nobody in the history of their family line had ever owned land before. So it's a very big deal. The other thing, of course, Marcia, was some of them would go in and see the Nickel Theater, the Movie-Tone News in town, and they would see these Movie-Tone News images of what was going on in the cities of the United States in the 1930s. And what would they see? Long bread lines, soup kitchens, people selling apples on the street. And they said, why should we go there? We at least have something here. We have a piece of dirt. We can raise some chickens. Maybe we can do something. And also, and this is the way all historical disasters are, you don't know you're in the middle of one of these when you're in the middle of it.